All right. Well, welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bulls Central, and I am joined with me today by a very special guest. He's been covering the Bulls previously as a beat writer for The Athletic, also beat writer for the Warriors for a bit, formerly the co-host of Bulls HQ, and now you know him as the beat writer covering the Bulls for CHGO. It is my pleasure to welcome to the show Will Gottlieb. Will, it's great to have you on, and thanks for making the time, man.
Yeah, of course. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks, Jamal.
For sure. Now, if you're not already, be sure to check out all the great work Will and the rest of the CHGO team they've been putting together. Be sure to subscribe to the CHGO channel and the podcast. I'll leave a link to it below. They're putting out daily content on the Bulls, whether through podcasts or columns. So make sure you check it out. You can also follow Will on Twitter at @Won'tGottlieb. I'll leave a link to that below as well. Now, Will, we're right in the thick of the NBA offseason. We got free agency set to commence on Thursday. We just had the NBA draft, which featured a lot of trades, movements throughout the league. Trade rumors and speculation, they continue to run rampant. That being said, though, the Bulls, despite, being involved in a lot of trade rumors, have remained relatively quiet, at least at the time we're recording this anyway. I think a lot of people were expecting the Bulls to be a little more active on draft night. There was a lot of talk about the Bulls looking to shop the 18th pick after it was selected, along with Kobe White in a package, or even look to trade down in the draft, but we didn't see any of that. The Bulls ended up using the pick to select Dalen Terry. Were you surprised at all with how things kind of turned down or went down on draft night?
A little. It felt like there was so much noise coming into the draft that something was going to happen. I always felt like Rudy Gobert was pretty unlikely on draft night just because, in my opinion, they kind of need to decide or have Zach decide what he's going to do before they can really make a move like that. They can have some sort of unsigned agreement right now or whatever it may be. But until Zach really puts his signature on a contract, I would be pretty hesitant to mortgage the future for a guy like Rudy Gobert and just end up straddling the play-in tournament with him and DeMar for a couple of years. So as far as trading up or down, it sounded like they were trying to have some movement. Didn't really have any bites with the Kobe White plus 18 to move up. And frankly, I think, unless you're moving into Jalen Durant territory or, top 10, it probably didn't make sense just because I think this draft was not very strong. I did like what the Grizzlies did as far as who was it that traded back with the Anthony Melton. So there were a couple of different options out there, but I think basically they just kind of had a guy and he fell into their laps and they took him.
Well, let's talk about Dalen Terry. I also do want to talk about Rudy Gobert since you mentioned him as well. But because I'll admit, this guy wasn't on my radar when looking at draft prospects at all. So when the Bulls selected him, I had to do a little more research on my end. And the more I looked at the kid, the more I'm loving the pick because I'm all about high energy, defensive minded guys that can do a little bit of everything. I know you were actually super high on the pick. You had him, what was it, number 3 on your draft board? I think it was behind Tari Eason, Jalen Williams, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
How do you like the overall fit? Based on the current construction of the roster and the fact that the Bulls are really in win now mode, realistically, how much playing time do you think he's going to get in his rookie season?
Yeah, I'll start with the sort of draft profile. He was kind of a late riser for me. I didn't really learn too much about him until late. And he seemed like he was going to be maybe a fringe first rounder, but sort of close to the week of the draft, it really seemed like he started to rise into the mid-20s area. And so it felt like maybe a little bit of a stretch. But as I said, this draft was pretty flat after, I think the Bulls were the cutoff. Like there were 17 good prospects. Beyond 18 to maybe 35, it seemed like everybody was kind of approximately the same. Maybe they should have drafted a bigger guy who could shoot better or a big man who could protect the rim. You could argue any of that, but I really like Dalen Terry. I think in today's NBA, basically you need guys that can be really long and versatile defensively, that can switch and that can handle the ball and play make and make good decisions. And he does all of that stuff at a really high level with a really intense motor and enthusiasm for the game that really nobody else on the Bulls has right now. So I think he'll be sort of an emotional leader for this group, which they kind of need. Like DeMar and Zach and Vooch are very calm and sort of quiet and reserved in the way that they lead. It's very much by example. Pat and Io are the same way. And I think they need a little energy, that dog mentality that people are kind of joking about on Twitter these days. But I do think there's some truth there. So I really like Dalen. He probably went a little higher than most people were expecting. I've also heard some like criticism about him being redundant with IO, not being a shooter. These things are maybe true, but again, in today's NBA, you just need to be able to have versatility on the wings, and I think he's probably one of the best in the draft class at that. So I was really excited about him, and I think in terms of playing time, they're going to give him opportunities, but if it'll just come down to like, if he's good enough, then he'll play. And if they need a guy like that, he'll crack the rotation. Obviously, Io got a ton of minutes last year. A lot of that was due to injuries, unfortunately, but I do think Billy will, put him in the lineup if the moment makes sense, and then, he'll have an opportunity to seize a role. And I think they kind of need somebody who can play. He'll probably have to play up a little bit, like 3-4 rather than 2-3. So that might be a bit of a challenge. He needs to put on some muscle, but I think he'll definitely carve out a role for himself if he's good enough.
Yeah, and that was kind of my thought exactly too, right? Because I saw a lot of people on Twitter saying, "Why are we drafting another guard?" I wouldn't really consider him, a guard. I mean, he can play, but it's like he's going to need to be the more of that 3 or 4 type of role. And because of that, he's going to need to put on some more weight. It's going to be a bit of a rude awakening going from the college level to the NBA level, going against some of these much bigger power forwards if he needs to start defending that role. But I agree. I think there was a lot of things that I liked about the pick after looking at it. I am curious, though, because, we talked about what he can bring. Not only did they just introduce him at the press conference yesterday, you had the photo shoot of him in the uniform, the whole bit, right? But I have to ask, do you think there's any way that the Bulls potentially still package him in a trade for a bigger name that can help the Bulls win now? Or do you think it's pretty clear the Bulls are going to be holding on to this guy?
What I like about what Arturas and Mark Eversley have done so far is that they are kind of straddling the line between player development and win now. And I think that sets them up well to make a big move if they decide it's the right moment. And I think ultimately that's kind of what it comes down to with Gobert is like, do you think he's the guy worth, mortgaging the future for? And we can get into that later, but I think to answer your question, I think they are definitely in a position to still move Dalen Terry, Patrick Williams, Io, even in some cases, to go get that guy, because they obviously want to win now, but they also need younger guys to fill out the roster on cheap contracts who can produce. So that's a great way to fill out the roster with sort of smaller contracts, and then also hopefully these guys develop into players. So excuse me. I think it's likely that they keep that younger core together, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me if they go all in at some point.
Yeah, and it might have been kind of a leading question, but that actually is where I wanted to go next. I want to talk about Rudy Gobert for a minute, because that's probably been the biggest, trade rumor or a guy being linked to the Bulls this offseason so far anyway. And you actually wrote about loving the idea of the Bulls trading for Gobert and how you love it if the Bulls made this big all-in move, which for the record, I am also for the idea of trading Gobert. I made a whole video about why the Bulls should go all in for Gobert. I really do think they would elevate this team to really being a title contender. And when you combine Gobert and the perimeter defense of Lonzo and Caruso and the offensive firepower of Zach and DeMar, what I'm curious about, though, is based on AK Mark Eversley's comments, both at the end of the playoffs to more recently, even as of yesterday, you were at, the press conference yesterday, that they're still focused on the continuity of this team. Mark even said, we're looking to bring in rim protectors to complement Buchevich. Do you think the idea of trading for Gobert is more of a pipe dream than anything at this point, that us fans have sort of built up in our heads while the front office has really no intention to make such move? Because again, they would have to include Buchevich, likely even Patrick Williams and or Kobe White. And you would have to think they're going to include, again, recent draft pick of Dalen Terry. Like, it doesn't seem like the front office has any intention on moving those guys. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like they have any intention until they make the move. And we'll never know if they do that or not. But yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on it because it's definitely a hefty price to pay. But I think people don't really appreciate how good Rudy Gobert is. And they say, oh, let's get Mo Bamba or Mitchell Robinson. And I think we talk a lot on our show about guys who are unplayable in meaningful minutes, who are very limited in what they provide as role men and rim protectors. And it's kind of funny to me that people are so adamant about getting one of these guys who are going to take up the full mid-level exception and prevent the Bulls from bringing in any shooters or wing defenders, who are going to play behind Vooch and play, 12 to 18 minutes per game, not close games, and kind of give you the same thing that Vooch gives you in terms of playing that drop defense and pick and pop. So I think Vooch is really good. I think people got frustrated with him because he's not that, emphatic rim protecting, shot blocking center, and his 3-point shot didn't fall this year. And basically that just needs to happen for him to be good enough to, contribute and make this team really good. But I think rim protection is not the biggest problem. If you were to get somebody as good as Rudy Gobert, though, I think that is a different story, where if you spend the mid-level on a guy like Mo Bamba or Mitchell Robinson, that's how you end up with, a mediocre rim protector who can't play a ton of minutes. But if you get Rudy Gobert, who's not only the best in the league at that, but one of the best in NBA history at that really changes your outlook. And so I totally agree that would make them a contender, but it's a very hefty price to pay. Obviously the contract is huge, and I don't really care about what he's making, but it does affect the front office's ability to add more more talent around the fringes. So it becomes a little bit complicated. They would have to dip into the luxury tax, which obviously we know the ownership does not like to do.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into it, but at the end of the day, I think if you want to compete in this league, you have to have the best talent, and Rudy Gobert is the best talent. So if they want to compete, they should probably go get him. I understand the hesitancy to move Patrick Williams and Dalen Terry and Kobe White and all these young guys. But they have this window, right? It's 2 years where DeMar is under contract and going to be good. And you can either pretend to compete with DeMar, or you can really go do it. But you can't wait for a better offer to come around, because you just have these 2 years. And so you don't know what's going to happen next year. But a better move may never come across, and then you've just kind of killed this time. So there is some urgency, and there is a bit of a time constraint on doing this as well.
Well, do you think, you're a little more closely connected to the front office, or at least, you see their body language, you interact with them based on the work that you do. Like I said, is it something that we've just, as fans, sort of built up in our heads that the idea of Gobert is actually realistic? What are the chances you think of something like that actually happening are?
Of Gobert getting traded?
Traded to the Bulls, yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty hard to say for me at this point. I do think it's a real possibility. This stuff doesn't come out from newsbreakers like Mark Stein and Jake Fisher unless there actually have been some conversations. Now, some of this stuff comes out after the conversations have been killed, and that's when teams are letting the intel out. But I do think the Bulls are definitely a suitor, and they're high on the list. Obviously, a team like the Jazz, if they're gonna ship out, their best player, all due respect to Donovan Mitchell, they're gonna want good young talent. And maybe a team like the Hawks gets in there and they have a better offer than the Bulls, or some other team. Maybe there's an Ayton for Gobert swap that goes on. Who knows? But I do think the Bulls are at the top of the list, and it's really about whether they want to pull the trigger with Patrick.
Well, I was just going to ask that. You're talking about good young talent, right? And I think Patrick Williams is that piece that would have to be included. I believe in your article you said that, you would be okay with that. It sounds like the Bulls are unwilling to include Patrick Williams, at least based on reports. Do you think that would be a mistake if that held up the deal? If it was a matter of you include Patrick Williams in a package versus not including him, and that means you get Gobert or not, do you think that would be a mistake on the front office's part?
That's, I think, where it gets really tricky. You have the opportunity cost of not only do you do it or not, but what happens if you don't do it? And I think that's where the time frame and the time constraint of DeMar's window comes into play. So on the one hand, I think it would be a mistake to not go all in during the DeMar window, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a mistake if the front office feels like Gobert is not the guy that gets them over and they would rather wait and see.
Sure.
There's definitely risk on both sides. And I think at the end of the day, at this point, I would feel comfortable either way. But I think if you're the front office and you have an opportunity to add, a true all-star caliber player who would, in my opinion, definitely make you, one of the top couple teams in the East and certainly give you like a runway to the finals, I think that would be a mistake to, not ship out a prospect who won't be able to contribute at a high enough level for years.
Yeah.
And that's going to miss the DeMar DeRozan window.
Let's talk about free agency for a little bit, since that will officially begin. Less than 72 hours or so? I say officially because what's that?
Can't wait for it.
Yes, I cannot wait for it as well. I say officially, right, because obviously we know those kind of free agency conversations are probably happening beforehand.
That would never happen. That will never happen.
I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Zach Lavine and his free agency, because I think more or less that's a foregone conclusion at this point based on reports, what the front office has continued to express, that Zach is going to get that 5-year max, stay with the Bulls. He's probably going to accept that 5-year max offer unless there's just some wild outside chance that he wants to play for another team that actually has cap space, which is only a few of them, and he's going to leave $55 million on the table. So outside of Zach, curious to know, who is your number one realistic free agent target you would like to see the Bulls sign based on the cap space available to them? We're just talking about mid-level exceptions, and obviously based on what's needed on the roster.
Yeah, I would say the mid-level exception is really the one big resource that the Bulls have. That'll be about $10.3 million. And I would say they are one of the few teams with that resource that is the most competitive, if that makes sense. So like the intersection between having that money and also being good, there aren't a ton of teams out there with that combination. So I think the Bulls are in good position to sign, a good free agent. I think it sounds like PJ Tucker is going to be a 76er or maybe stay with the Heat. But he would definitely be my number one. I mean, they absolutely need him. Like they need that guy who can shoot 45, 50% on corner threes, who can guard 4s and 5s at a really high level, who can allow you to switch in closing moments. He would definitely be number one for me. TJ Warren is another big one. I think that the Bulls could go after. Great size, 6'8", shoots the ball at a really high level, can add that third scorer element and play with DeMar and Zach, or with one or the other in bench units. I think he'd be really good, but there's a ton of risk there because he hasn't played in 2 years.
Right.
And he has that dog mentality. And if you'll remember in the bubble, going at it with Jimmy Butler. So yep. I think he'd be great just in terms of size and skill set. He'll also probably have some suitors. And then, as I mentioned, the risk there with the injuries. And then my third guy, I think, is a center, Isaiah Hardenstein from the Clippers.
Yeah.
Really high on him. His advanced stats are really, really impressive, and he's never really had an opportunity to step up into a bigger role. He started a bunch of games for the Clippers this year, and they obviously were around 500 without PG and Kawhi for most of the year. So I think he can play at a very high level and provide some relief for Vooch and potentially take over for Vooch after the last year of his contract. So I'd be high on him. I wonder what kind of money he's going to make. But those are, I think, my top three at this point.
So you're not as high on Mitchell Robinson as much as a lot of Bulls fans are.
Yeah, I think one, I think it sounds most likely that he's going to return to the Knicks.
Yeah.
But two, as I mentioned, like unless you're getting that premier elite exception to the rule sort of rim protector, I just don't think those guys are super valuable. And I'd rather see them get somebody who can protect the rim a little bit, but also be a playmaker.
Yeah.
And has a really high steal rate and can defend in space a little bit better and understands the game a little bit better. I think Mitch has learned a lot and, reduced his insane foul rate and trying to jump and bite at every single shot. But for me, he's a little bit lower on my list just because I think that style of player is a little less appealing to me. But as I mentioned, like a big wing is definitely going to be my primary target. And then, if they decide to go with the big man route, he would be a little bit further down the list, but not too far.
Now, there are two other guys on this roster that I did want to talk about because they're both extension eligible. They'll be on expiring contracts, next season if an extension isn't reached, and it's Nikola Vucevic and Kobe White. I personally think that neither player will be getting extensions this offseason. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong if you feel differently. That's not to say they won't be re-signed after their contracts expire, but I just don't think they're going to be getting early extensions. What are your thoughts on the long-term fit for both of these guys? Do you think both will still be in a Bulls uniform by the end of next season?
The Vooch one is really tricky because basically, as part of like the Gobert conversation, if you don't trade for Gobert, then you're losing your starting center in free agency next year unless you extend him.
Right.
And is extending Vooch beyond, I mean, he's older. He's going to be in his age 32 season, I believe. Yeah. So is that more of a risk than going out and getting slightly younger, albeit still 30, Gobert? I'm not sure. But I do think Vooch, if they can't figure out what to do this summer, they will probably extend Vooch and try to get him on a reasonable number and then look to trade him in the future if they want, unless they go out and get somebody like Hardenstein, who they think can take over as the starting center once Vooch expires, or maybe they trade Vooch at the deadline. But they do have a decision to make with him pretty soon. And I think probably the most likely outcome is that they extend him on a reasonable contract that will allow them to trade him in the future, should they decide to. With Kobe, I kind of see that one playing out as Lauri Markkanen did, where he plays into his restricted free agency. The Bulls say, go get a contract and we'll negotiate a sign and trade. I do think it is a little concerning to me that the Bulls couldn't even move up from 18 if they packaged Kobe. It doesn't seem like he has much of a market on in the rest of the league right now. And so who knows what he would get. And it almost seems at this point like they might just be better off keeping him and hoping he turns into something than sort of dumping him for the sake of dumping him. They could also package him with Vooch for somebody like Gobert or Ayton or something like that. But my guess is that they keep him around until they can move off of him for something that isn't, pennies on the dollar.
Yeah. I was actually pretty surprised, Kobe's trade value. I'm not saying that it's high by any means, but like you said, it's kind of clear that maybe there just isn't much of a market for him, which is a little surprising to me. I mean, he's only 22 years old. He can still shoot the ball just inconsistently, but if he continues to develop, he could get a little better. Are you surprised by that at all, that Kobe White and his trade value just maybe really isn't there? And like you said, maybe it makes more sense to just hang on to him for the last year of his deal. He plays in the restricted free agency, kind of play a, prove it year, like you said, with Lauri Markkanen and see how he does, rather than just, dumping him for, say, a second round pick or, getting pennies on the dollar. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, on the one hand, I kind of tell myself, well, he's only 22 and he's had some good, numbers when the Bulls were not really competitive and he was, allowed to just run up and down the court and shoot threes. But at the same time, like, all these Bulls fans have been like banging their heads saying how bad Kobe is and then throwing their arms up in the air because the Bulls can't get anything for him. Like, it doesn't really work like that. Yeah. If you think he sucks and you watch him every night, then chances are other teams are going to also think he sucks. Now, there are teams out there who have really good developmental programs like the Heat or the Spurs or the Pelicans even, for example, who really turn guys into players. And maybe a team like that wants to see if they can mold him into something. But a lot of those teams are competitive and don't necessarily want to take on a project like that right now. So I think there will probably be some sort of market for him just because of the draft pedigree, just because of some of the numbers that he has been able to put up on bad teams. I mean, he can obviously play basketball. He just hasn't learned the game yet. He hasn't figured out reads. He hasn't figured out how to play within a, functioning offense. And obviously his defense is really poor. So I think he's still obviously got some potential, but it's going to take a team that's interested in a project like that, who they can really build into a player. And then, of course, as soon as he goes to a team like that and starts playing well, everybody's going to be pissed off that the Bulls gave him away for nothing. So they can't win.
I wanted to ask this question, and now it's probably more or less moot at this point, based on what we learned yesterday of Kyrie Irving. It sounds like he's going to be opting into his last year with the Nets, which likely means the trade rumors behind Kevin Durant are probably not going to be coming to fruition. But I did want to ask, chances of Kevin Durant with the Bulls. I personally think it's unlikely, but I got a lot of my audience that's been asking about it, so I've got you on the channel. Want to hear your thoughts. What do you think the chances of Kevin Durant actually coming to Chicago are? And if it even makes sense for the Bulls, because you're going to have to give up a lot in a trade for him if you want to make it happen.
So Kevin is entering the first year of a extension. So he's got 4 years left on his contract, which means he doesn't really have the leverage that can say, send me where I want to go.
Sure.
So even if he did say the Bulls are my number one option, which, let's face it, is probably not going to be true. I mean, it could be, but I think it's a pretty small chance. The Nets have no reason to say, okay, fine, we'll send him there instead of taking the best possible offer. Now, there is some leverage in terms of, well, I'm going to be really unhappy and I'm going to pull a Ben Simmons and just not play if I get sent to, the Cavs. Sorry, just not going to do it. And so maybe the Cavs don't want to ship over Evan Mobley. And the best prospect available does become Patrick Williams. That's probably the one situation where I can see it happening. I think even then it's really unlikely. And then, as you said, the Kyrie stuff kind of puts it to bed for me. He could still get traded, Kyrie, but and that might open the door for Kevin to go. But I think very, very small likelihood, although, it's fun to fantasize about it.
Yeah, I'll get you out on this question, and it's regarding trades, since obviously, Bulls can still look to improve the roster through trades, which we've talked about, and, not just free agency. Aside from Rudy Gobert, what's a trade you would like to see the Bulls make this offseason to really round out the roster?
Ooh, that's a good one. I haven't really thought too much about that. I guess for me, it's probably going to be something smaller on the margins. One that just comes to mind right now is not that exciting, but like Chuma Okeke from the Magic or Kenyon Martin Jr. from the Rockets, a younger forward that doesn't really have a place in their current team. They're kind of buried down the depth chart because, those guys have brought in Paulo Banchero and maybe Jonathan Isaac comes back and you've got Franz Wagner. So maybe there just isn't a ton of room now for a guy like Okeke. Same for Houston. Like they've got Tari Eason and Jabari Smith and, a handful of other forwards. So a younger guy like that who could, be cheap, but also come in and potentially produce, I think would be great. I would have to think more about that, but those are the two that come to mind.
Yeah, I kind of put you on the spot there. I mean, there's
kind of boring answers. Sorry for people who are hoping that they trade for like Kevin Durant or something.
I mean, that's the thing, right? It also has to be realistic. You can easily just say, well, we should just trade for Giannis, right? We should trade for Luka. No, I mean, and the thing is, there's so many different options and scenarios that you can go through when it comes to trades, right? I mean, it depends on how
that's exactly right.
It's
like, what do the Bulls have to ship out that would be valuable to somebody else? We just talked about Kobe's value right now. I mean, maybe they trade Lonzo or Caruso. I really doubt it.
Yeah.
Vooch is kind of the guy, so Gobert would be probably the most, I don't want to say realistic because we don't know if that actually happens, but the kind of trade that I could see happening. So I do think if the Bulls are going to make trades right now, it will be either a huge swing or very small ones along the margins. But yesterday, for some reason, this was like a topic of controversy on Twitter, but Arturas said that, they're going to look to explore, improving their team through the three possible ways you can: trade, draft, and free agency. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are any trades, maybe some sign-in trades. They obviously worked that pretty well last summer. So we'll see. But I think there's a small chance that they make a huge swing and a more likely chance that they take some smaller swings on potentially younger forwards, ideally along the margins.
I mean, that's the other thing you kind of mentioned that I think is important that Bulls fans need to remember is that in a trade, both parties have to agree, and you have to understand what the person or what the team is that's, what they're getting in return, and are they actually going to be enticed or interested in it. The Bulls, as far as their actual trade chips, there's not a ton, right? I mean, like you said, Patrick Williams is probably their biggest trade asset when it comes to younger talent that could be intriguing from a potential standpoint. They don't have a ton of draft capital either. I mean, they got the Portland pick, which is great. But it's lottery protected, which it looks like it's probably going to convey next season based on what Portland is doing. So I think it's important to remind Bulls fans that there's two sides, or three, if you're doing a 3-team trade in a trade, and you have to consider what the other team is going to be getting in return.
Exactly. And like the other thing is, it's not only like would they agree to do it, but a lot of times like these teams want to feel like they won the trade. So
right.
You have to like look at it from the other perspective and say, do I come away with this deal feeling like I got the better end of the bargain?
Right.
And in most trades involving Kobe White, that's probably not going to be something that's super interesting. And that's why you hear guys like Patrick Williams being named in Gobert rumors, because like, yeah, it would be like a coup if they could do it for just Kobe and Buchevich, but like, why would the Jazz ever do that?
Right, exactly.
And they're not just like dumping him to dump him. So especially a guy like Danny Ainge, who's like historically really been,
he's looking to fleece
the
people.
one who wants to fleece people. Exactly.
Yeah. I know I said last question, but one last, what's that?
Keep them coming.
One last one. Bulls record next season. How many wins do you think they're going to get? Based on what we know right now, so early, but let's hear it.
I honestly think they end up probably around the same number that they are right now.
Okay.
I think they maybe a win or two better, but at this point, like you have to factor in missed games, right? Like it's just unreasonable to think that Lonzo and Caruso are going to play the full season.
Yeah.
I think it's unreasonable to think that DeMar is going to be as good as he was last year. I think it's reasonable to say Vooch and Zach will be better because they were, I mean, Zach especially, like the second half of the season just was playing at 50%, and Vooch shot, 31% on threes. That's just simply not as good as he can be. So if all else stays the same, I think they'll be approximately the same just based on those two things evening out. But they could still add some more talent. Obviously, other teams in the league are getting better, and that maybe hurts their chances a little bit. But they were super hot to start the year, and they were super cold for the last bit. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, and they'll end up approximately, 45, 46, 47 wins.
And better playoff outcome than we saw last year?
I hope so. You have to think that they're in a better position with a little bit more depth, with Lonzo hopefully playing and Caruso hopefully being healthy and Zach hopefully being healthy, and a year of experience. Like, we're never going to have this whole, is Patrick Williams just an empty calorie scorer? He's never made the playoffs for the first 8 years of his career situation, because he's made the playoffs. Yeah. And I think that experience really does go a long way. Just watching these games, you kind of forget like how intense they are and how much attention to detail you need to have. And the Bucks are a really good team. I know they lost in the second round to the Celtics, but they are a really good team. And I think the Bulls had a lot to take away from that series that they can hopefully use moving forward. So they've got to play better. They've got to add more talent, and they've got to leverage the experience they now have into playing better. But I think it's definitely on the table.
Yeah. Will, I really do appreciate you making the time. Keep up the great work at CHGO. Really love the content you guys have been putting out. I'm looking forward to following along you guys this upcoming season. So for those watching, make sure you check out the links below so you can follow CHGO. And Will, keep up the great work, man.
Thank you so much. And it was really fun to join you. I'm happy to come on anytime.